It is the Final Word Cricket podcast, season 18, episode 13. Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon with you today for Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, Australia's number one plaintiff law firm. What a ridiculously big week it's been in global cricket, ranging from a war that nearly was or briefly was, a ceasefire, a cancellation, a suspension of two of the most important T20 tournaments in the world. The World Test Championship is around the corner, so We'll talk about what we've heard from today in relation to Cricket Australia and the squad they've announced for that final at Lords, which is inside a month from now. Some crazy stuff going on in World Cup qualifiers, an excellent county round, plenty more besides. Hello, Jeff in Lisbon.
Hello. It was one of those weeks where I think in retrospect, it's good that our recording date was a few days later because there were any number of 4 or 5 days where things were just moving so quickly. And in some ways you're thinking, well, as a news-focused show, we should be talking about the news that's happening, but it all would have been out of date within a couple of hours. It's the peril of the breaking news cycle, whereas now somehow, against all odds, things seem to have reached a point of calm, of some level of calm at least. So it's a relief. I mean, the word ceasefire it's a relief to see that, and I wish we could see it in a bunch of other places as well. But well done to those involved who managed to bring temperatures down and bring the boil down to a simmer at least.
And that prompts a long conversation we'll have in a moment. And I neglected to mention in the intro, a bloke called Virat Kohli retired from Test cricket this week, as did Rohit Sharma. So we will pay tribute to their
I've heard of both of them.
Test careers. And the way I introed you there, it was almost like Lisbon calling, given it's Eurovision week. There'll be something to be said for that. Probably not, though. I think I'm going to...
Is it in Lisbon? Where's
Eurovision? It's in Basel. Switzerland this year.
Oh.
So, yes, I will be watching, but I may not be as invested in it as much this year as I have been in other years because I've got a bit on my plate at the moment. Jeff, before we talk about the various issues of the week, there was a sad piece of news out of Australia over the weekend. Bob Cowper passing away at age 84. An iconic Australian cricketer of his time, of course, that triple century at the MCG, the Ashes 307 in the mid-60s. One of those cricketers who had a brief career because he chose to pursue his professional interests in the commercial world. He retired at age 27 or 28 or something like that. This was well documented by Gideon Haigh and by Dan Brettig over the weekend, where he went overseas and enjoyed success in Monaco and ultimately came back to cricket as an ICC
doing what?
match
Was he getting successful in Monaco with?
On
the blackjack tables.
Not quite, but he worked in the commercial world around the world and had he was childhood friends with John Elliott. And they that elders relationship. But they were huge operators in the 80s, weren't they? So that's where he made his wealth. But the game was one he was still willing to give back to in various ways, acknowledging that he was briefly a Test and one-day international match referee, a long-term rep to the ICC back in that generation as well. And before that, he was a bit of a mentor to Ian Chappell around the time that they were considering their own rights with payment and remuneration and the way that led towards World Series cricket. So Cowper's story of leaving the game to find wealth elsewhere helped shape the thinking of other cricketers who thought that, well, hang on a second, maybe we should be collecting more out of our labour. So, yeah, had an influence on a number of Australian cricketers at that time and left a big mark on the game. And Jeff, as you know, as an MCC member, the amount of times that you walk into that bar at the MCG with the Cowper 307, he remains an icon of the G.
Well, that's, when you say iconic, it's helped when you've got your name up on the wall in big letters so that even people who don't know the story of that player know that that player exists. So you've got the highest score and the best bowling figures home and away. So you've got the Sarfraz, Noah's 9 for up there. You've got Arthur Maley, and until recently Viv Richards, who was sadly replaced by Alistair Cook. But for so long in our childhoods, it was those four unmoved, unending, enduring those names and that 307 above the Percy Beams, which is the bar where people spend so much time. Yeah, it's a pattern at the moment. I guess it's not to overuse the word, but that era is iconic, that late 60s, early 70s. So many of those players are players we know from Chappelle's war stories on commentary for 40 years afterwards. And there is a sequence. That generation is of an age where they're leaving this realm and going somewhere else. So, Ian Redpath recently, Keith Stackpole and Bob Cowper all in the last few weeks, really.
Yeah. You go back to probably 6 months ago when Redpath passed away, Stackpole a few weeks ago, Cowper, now you're spot on. They're all in their sort of early to mid-80s, aren't they? So that's a sad piece of news coming out of Australia. Moving to the cricket side of things, Rohit Sharma retired. I don't know how to deal with this. It's such a big topic, Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli finishing as Test cricketers. I don't know whether we should do it as one job lot here, Jeff, or separate the two. Maybe we start with. It feels
it's nice that they go together. Yeah. Although, so Rohit goes first, and it was a bit like, I don't know, like a group parachuting expedition. Rohit jumps out, and that gives Kohli the courage to jump out after him, perhaps, or maybe it was the other way. It felt for a little while like Kohli might stay on because Rohit had gone. Like maybe Kohli was planning to retire. Rohit gets in first and trumps him and says, psych, I'm retiring. And then Kohli's like, well, okay, well, maybe I should stick around. And by reports, BCCI were trying to convince him to stick around, to say at least do the England tour, because we need you as the guy who's been to England so many times to lead the team off the field, even if you're not leading them on the field. And I think that was my feeling even during the Australian summer when Kohli was struggling and we were talking about that retirement, was that his value through 5 tests in England would be greater than the runs that he might or might not make. So there was that consideration. And then maybe he thought it's good to go out with Rohit because there's been, maybe it partly plays into it that there's been it's confected, manufactured this idea of conflict between them, which doesn't really exist between them, but exists between their fan bases. But in some ways, to pour oil on those waters, going out together is a nice way to do it, even though they didn't play their last test together because Rohit dropped himself for the last test of the Australian series, and Kohli did play. But, he couldn't find a way through that Australian summer after that 100 in the first game, the way he kept nicking and getting so angry with himself. And I wanted him to push on. I was willing him to push on because I wanted to see if he could find a way through one more time. But he's decided he's made too many attempts and it's time to call a stop.
Yeah, I agree with that. There was so much goodwill from us and from others as well, just wanting to see whether he could maybe not peak again, because his peak was absurd from 2014 to 2019 as a Test cricketer. His numbers were out of this world. And it's kind of nice that it mirrored the peak that Steve Smith was enjoying from around the same time.
Yeah.
Smith starts a little bit earlier, but runs through until about the same time in 2019 when the two of them were averaging in like the mid-70s and churning out 100 after 100 across a long, extended stretch of time when Australia and India were playing so much Test cricket against each other as well. So, but yeah, Kohli saying that he steps away from the format. It's not easy, but it feels right. There were reports about the involvement of BCCI and wanting him to stay on after Rohit made his decision. The extent to which the family guidelines played a role, that's been speculated in the Indian press. Not quite so sure about that. I mean, I'm not dismissing.
I think that's nonsense. I think that the family guidelines weren't that families can't tour. It was that you need to pay for families to tour.
I think it was more what it was saying, the signal that it was sending about the involvement of families on tour. And Kohli, he has had his money where his mouth is on this for a long time. He missed 3 Test matches in the Border Gavaskar in 2021. And then he missed the England series last year for the birth of his second child. And but the reason I don't think it had much of an effect on this particular series, whether he went around in England, he lives in London, right? So like, it's not, it's a bit different to if this series were on the other side of the world to where he lives. He's based here. So, well, most of the year he's based here anyway. So, but anyway, I digress. My point is that there was clearly machinations behind the scenes, and then Kohli decided to go on his own terms. There was a really nice point that Bharat made on SEN earlier today about this link in the chain, about Kohli's first Test 100 being the one in Adelaide, his first in a sequence in Australia, but the one in Adelaide in that disastrous series of 2011-2012, which proved to be the final test of Dravid and Lakshman, who neither of whom really got the big goodbye. They just finished in Australia because of a series failure there, and that's essentially what's happened here with Kohli and Rohit. Had they made a truckload of runs in Australia, I suspect they would have gone on. Why wouldn't they have? But there's that link there between Kohli taking over from that generation. From about that time, it took a while to establish himself as a superstar, of course, but that's the moment when he proved he was going to be a real presence at Test level and going on to be that standard bearer in a variety of ways. We'll go to his captaincy in a moment, but batting alone in excess of 9,000 Test runs, 30 Test centuries. The numbers might look a little bit light if you look at them and go, a guy who averaged 46 in Test cricket didn't get 10,000 Test runs, but that belies the enormous presence he had as the definitive player of his generation, along with Steve Smith, through that period of time between 2014 and 2019 when he was everything. He was everything. And it meant an awful lot to the whole country that he was able to do such remarkable things either side of him taking over the captaincy.
I think definitions of greatness are very arbitrary, and we seem to have, we've had that red line that you draw of 50. You've got to average 50 to be a great batter in Test cricket, which clearly you don't, because there are a lot of players who don't, whose stories are up there. And there are players who did average 50 who I'm going to tip that only the most badgery badgers would know a lot about. Eddie Painter or Ernest Tildesley or Charlie Davis, right? These are people who, if you listen to Storytime, if you listen to our history show, you've probably heard of them, and we've learned about them through making that show, but we probably wouldn't have known much about them 6 or 7 years ago, whereas now we do. That statistical mark isn't the decider. It's just that a lot of great players, a lot of those 50 averaging players are super famous ones that people have heard of. I mean, there's probably no more famous cricketer after Tendulkar than Kohli, certainly in the modern era. So I think more than, the average is 46, whatever. I've been looking at some of this because we're, peek behind the curtain, we're working on a Storytime book, you and I, that will hopefully be out later this year. And one of the things I've been looking at for a story I'm working on, it involves Bill Ponsford and the fact that he didn't quite average 50, but some of the other things he did were absurd and reflected greatness in a bunch of other ways. I mean, Kohli made 30 Test hundreds. I think that's more the number for me, because 29 was the high water mark for so long. Nobody had passed Bradman for so long, and eventually players started doing it. And there are a bunch of players in the modern era who did get into the 30s with their Test hundreds. Kohli did that, went past Bradman with his last 100 in Perth, and I think that means more to me than whether or not a couple of years where he struggled meant that he dipped from 50.05 to 46.8.
And that he was doing much of that great work when he was the captain of the team and changing the way that Indian cricket felt. I remember standing out on the Oval and doing a piece with Harsha during the 2018 series over here. Now, India didn't win that series, but it was the way they were changing the way they wanted to win. It was about the fast bowlers, and Kohli was instrumental to that, to shaping the way that he wanted a group of fast bowlers to win around the world. And that went on to be exactly what they did in 2018-19 in Australia, and again in 2020-21. I know the Kohli wasn't there after Adelaide, but it's the architecture that he set up as captain. And he found his way. Like, you go to Kohli in the early part of his captaincy career, he did thrive off hostility and sheer aggression, and that worked for him then to an extent, although I would say it was counterproductive at points in, say, 2017 during the Border Gavaskar when his emotions got the better of him. But when talking with him last year when doing Glenn Maxwell's book, he acknowledges now that didn't always work for him either. It was a careful balancing act, and sometimes he got it right and sometimes he went too far, and he had to find a way to moderate that. And you see that maturity, and you see the way he evolved as a human being, I think, in the way that he celebrated his hundreds after the long drought, after he was captain at Ahmedabad in 2023. Jeff, you and I were there for that, 2,100 days between Test tons or whatever it was, and just how grateful he was and the way he acknowledged the crowd, the beaming smile on his face. You can't imagine Kohli celebrating that way in the earlier parts of his career when he was more of a machine. And indeed at Perth last year when he blew kisses to his wife in the crowd and his young children as well, which was just a lovely moment. So, yeah, I've loved watching the way that Kohli's evolved into something of a statesman. When he talks, people listen. We haven't even referred to yet the influence he's had on Test cricket. This was the first thought that I had. In the absence of Virat Kohli constantly saying that line that we love hearing players say, that Test cricket's the most important format, then where would Test cricket be in India right now? We can't know. It's impossible to speculate, but it wouldn't be in as rude a health as it is if not for Kohli. and the way that he drew so many people into the format and kept reiterating why it matters so much to him and in turn the team that played for him. So, yeah, it's an enormous legacy. And, yeah, whether he averaged 50 or not, it's neither here nor there to me. As an Indian captain, he changed the face of the team. As a cricketer, he did remarkable things. His best was as good as anyone going around, and we're lesser for his retirement, but he'll continue to play a big role. And the fact that he's gone out with Rohit Sharma, forget about the stands and the Maddies on the internet, like the fact that those two finished their T20 careers as world champions. Yep, not quite the same. Still, not getting a farewell.
They're still listed one-day international players.
They may play one day when they've obviously won the Champions Trophy together 5 minutes ago as well. So they've enjoyed success towards the end.
So does this say they want to win a World Cup in 2027? Like, are they going to play 2 more years in one-day cricket, those two? Are they going to play one days only? It's a very niche thing to do.
It is.
I wonder how sustainable that is to be to only play the least played format for India. How many games are they going to be playing a year? 9, 12?
But they'll still be playing white ball cricket through the IPL, a season that's only going to get longer. So there would be scope for them to both do it. And I think because Kohli's retired, we haven't had the chance to acknowledge Rohit either as a captain and as a player. And I think that's worthy as well. We've got to come to that.
I did want to get to that. There was one other thing first, which was you talked about relinquishing kind of the captaincy, but effectively being sacked from the captaincy. Looking back on that, and I have thought this for a while, I think that was so. Particularly, Indian cricket is a game where behind the scenes politics plays a big part. There are always machinations. There are campaigns against certain leaders. There are people being undermined. That process, which was largely Sourav Ganguly has to carry the can for this, was maybe the greatest act of self-sabotage that I've seen from Indian cricket. The way that they campaigned against Kohli because he didn't want to lead the T20 national team anymore, which is an eminently reasonable thing for a player to do. A player managing workload goes, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't captain my IPL side because I've been doing that for a decade, and maybe I can give away the T20 team to a younger up-and-coming player and remain in charge for the one-day and the test teams, which is what he wanted to do initially. And then you had the absurd situation with Ganguly coming through and basically sacking him as the one-day captain as well, having this war of words about it where at least one party was lying about what had gone on and who had been offered what and which suggestions had been made to who. And Kohli effectively getting pushed out of that other white ball job, which he did want to keep, and then throwing his hands up and saying, well, I better quit the test captaincy as well because you'll push me out of there soon enough anyway. That really feels like the driver behind the slump. The really bad years happen after that. And sure, it's to do with COVID and things as well. And who knows what, you can't pinpoint it to an exact cause, but it felt like his fire went out for a long time at that point, that he was so deflated by the way that he'd been dispensed with after having been like clearly India's most successful captain, not just statistically, not just on win percentage, but the captain who was really able to turn that team around, which, Tendulkar as captain wasn't able to do. He didn't have the same quality of cattle, of course. He didn't have the same quality of fast bowlers particularly. But even just personality-wise, Tendulkar was a quiet achiever who went out there and led by example and occasionally cracked the shits with his dressing room and tried to rev them up, but that wasn't really his modus operandi. With Kohli, it was. So he's the single biggest influence in changing that Indian team from being a bit fragile to being a team that was hard to push around. And then he was dispensed with so summarily and with so little appreciation for that I think it really did wound him and dented his confidence. And we saw those next few years where he struggled to make a run across formats. So I still can't believe that they were that cavalier with, so wasteful with what they had, which was so different to what they'd had a few years earlier.
Yeah, I like that he had that last great moment as a captain in 2021. So it does go off the rails in 21-22 in South Africa, irrefutably. The yelling into the stump cam is just one of many examples of where he'd lost his way, and that became a more obvious decision. And you're right with the politics and how heavily that must weigh as well. But in 21, that final day at Lord's, the way in which he was able to the way he spoke to his team in that huddle at the front of the pavilion and told them how they were going to win that test match in 2 sessions and bowl out England on the final day. The way in which he stood on that balcony and was going for broke. Emotions were overriding all of it, but it didn't matter. It's what the moment called for. And then the fact that they won there and went on to win at the Oval. And this is where the Rohit story is important as well, and where the two of them intersect. Because Rohit Sharma, he was a late bloomer as a Test cricketer. Of course, he played in that final Kohli series, final Tendulkar series as well. My apologies, when he made his Test debut and got 100 and all the rest of it. But there was this disparity in stats between his home record and his away record, and often batting at number 6. But the beauty of what Rohit Mark II as a Test cricketer did, and most of this was as captain, he made himself a presence when it was tough. That 100 he made at Chennai against England in 2021 on a shit tip is one of the great modern hundreds. The fact that he was able to summon all of that concentration on a pitch that was shooting through on inside the first hour of play.
Yeah.
He had to grapple with that, and so did Kohli. Kohli's numbers, in part, have diminished towards the end because of the type of pitches that have been rolled out in India over the last 5 or 6 years.
But look at Rohit. Making 30 can be a good score,
exactly.
So it doesn't reflect in your overall stats. And correct. That Rohit innings wasn't just 100, it was 160-something, and no one else could make a run.
Completely defined the Test match, right? But he also did that at other times. Those 2 tests in London I referred to before in 2021, where they were rock and rolled for fuck all on day 1 at the Oval, and it felt like they were going to roll over. It was Rohit who stood up on that Saturday afternoon and put England to the sword, as he did at Lord's Talaya Foundation in the second Test of the series when they've been when they weren't able to win the week before at Leeds. But the point was that
and Nagpur against Australia
and Nagpur at the start of the series when it was tough. Exactly. So yes, Rohit's record of averaging 40 odd will tell you one story. But look into it in more depth. It'll tell you another about a guy who often did it when it was at its toughest in Test cricket, and having to take over the leadership from Kohli and all that crazy online, full-on intensity of the fandom. It's hard to comprehend how that must be for players like Rohit and Kohli as well, and being the guy who does it next. So, and still having the ability to win big series for India as Test captain and going on to win white ball trophies as well. So Rohit Sharma has had a most commendable Test career. And of course, the aesthetics of watching him bat. Was there a more purely beautiful opener to watch in the modern era? I doubt it. The ease and the elegance in which he did it and against the red ball was a lovely antidote or lovely complementary piece to the power that he expressed when playing white ball cricket. And
it felt, I mean, there was a contrast in style. There was the fire and ice kind of cliche where Rohit was usually so laid back, although, he does have a temper. He can lose it once in a while, but, we saw a bit of that during the series in Australia. But that was probably frustration with his own returns as well, I suppose. But yeah, there was that languidness, that easiness to his batting, particularly the flicks off the pads that would sail away for 6 that you still see him pull out in the T20 game. And there was the fact that you never quite knew what you were going to get because he was always a chance to get caught at fine leg. No matter how well he was going, there was always a decent chance he was going to hook one straight to fine leg. So it could be over at any minute.
Jeff, before we go to our first break, which we're going to have to take before we talk about what's happened in the IPL and the PSL, a word for our friends at Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, our principal partner on the show, Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm. Some of the best lawyers in the country at your disposal. We're just so thrilled that an organisation like Maurice Blackburn, with all that history in Australia back to 1919, would see fit to be with us through seasons 18 and 19, not least when it comes to superannuation insurance, which can be a complicated area of terrain, especially if you need it. Imagine the scenario upon which you might need superannuation insurance. That couldn't be a good time in your life. And knowing that there's an organisation like Maurice Blackburn who specialise in it, primarily working on a no-win, no-fee basis. So there's so much more to learn about Maurice Blackburn, stories that we're going to tell you of people who've directly benefited from their assistance through the weeks and months ahead through this 18th season of the podcast. But yes, if you need to engage with them, it's easy to do by simply searching Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. There's a link in our show notes as well. And a reminder that, yes, most of their work is done on that no-win, no-fee basis.